In the last video, when using Dr. Morgan Levine's biological age calculator, PhenoAge, we saw that my biological age was 13 years younger than the chronological. So what might be contributing to these data? So first, let's take a look at prescription meds. For those who are familiar with the channel, this isn't a surprise, but for those who are new, welcome. And I was diagnosed with hypothyroidism in my early 20s, so I've been taking levothyroxine, and the current dose is 137.5 micrograms per day. So I've been taking levothyroxine every day since my early 20s. All right, what about supplements? So the first is generally a staple, vitamin D. I live in Boston, so 8 or 9 months out of the year, I can't get adequate sun exposure, so I supplement with vitamin D. For the 42-day period that corresponded to this test, and note, just to define what that 42-day period is, it started immediately after blood test number 5, which was on July 26th, and it lasted through the day before blood test number 6, which was on September 5th. So that period is 42 days in between blood tests. So for that 42-day period, I supplemented with 1,000 IUs for 25 of those days, and then for 3 of those days, 2,000 IUs. So why did I increase vitamin D? Well, in my data, for whatever reason, it's inversely correlated with the nighttime respiratory rate, which I know is a marker of immune activation. And that's a whole story for another day, but to test that correlation, I increased vitamin D to see if I could reduce the nighttime respiratory rate and potentially reduce immune activation, potentially improve biomarkers like HRV and resting heart rate. The next supplement that I supplemented with was nicotinic acid, 50 to 60 milligrams per day, as very low levels increase NAD, at least in my case. So for this test, it was for 28 of the 42 days that corresponded to this period. I also supplemented with NMN for 3 of the 42 days at 800 to 1,000 milligrams per day for those 3 days. And I should say that was kind of a messing around with NMN for those 3 days. I just wanted to see if I subjectively felt different taking NMN versus low-dose nicotinic acid, and I didn't. So I'm happy to use nicotinic acid as it's cheaper, and it basically does the same thing as NMN, raise NAD, but at a far lower concentration. All right, and that's it. No other geroprotectors or senolytics for this test. And the emphasis is on for this test, because those who follow me on Patreon know that on September 10th, I started rapamycin. And I didn't do that with the goal of, hey, let's just see what happens. For whatever reason, in my data, Candida antibody levels, more specifically Candida IgG, has been elevated for all of the tests in 2024, which suggests that I had an active infection at some point in the past, and my body has to keep antibody levels at a relatively high level to suppress Candida. And I don't want that to be the case. I want Candida levels to be systemically low. Now, rapamycin is a known antifungal, so I took rapamycin specifically with the goal of reducing Candida IgG. I tested that on Friday. Results will be in about a week. They'll be posted on Patreon first. So if you're interested in that, check it out. So note that the story for prescription meds will be different for blood test number 7, as it will include rapamycin. All right, that's it for supplements, prescription meds, no geroprotectors or senolytics, which brings us to diet. What diet composition corresponded to the 42-day period for this test? And that's what we'll see here. We're going to take a look at the average daily dietary intake, and note that I weigh all my food. I've weighed all my food since 2015, so this is as close to accurate as one can get for quantifying dietary intake. The full list is shown here, and you can see that 55 foods are on the list. Technically, it could be 57 because I included NMN, but since I also supplemented with vitamin D and nicotinic acid, that would bring it to 57. So 54 foods without the supplements. The list is ranked in grams from highest to lowest, with 3 exceptions. Coffee, so that's not, I wasn't drinking 0.7 ounces per day. That's 1 20-ounce coffee. Nothing fancy, just black coffee that I made at home. That's how I like it. No sugar, nothing else. Straight black. Green tea, 20 ounces per day. And I note that I use loose leaf organic green tea sourced from Japan. If you want to use what I use, there's a discount link in the video's description. And then also pizza, which is ranked in calories. And I'll cover the pizza when we go over the cheat meals or cheat day section of the diet. All right, so what about experiments for this test? Now, at this point, when considering my biological age results using PhenoAge are pretty good, 13 years for this test. But for most tests in over the past 2 years, it's been generally 15 to 16 years younger than the chronological. So I'm not trying to blow up the system. I'm trying to make small tweaks with the goal of optimizing weak spots while still keeping the core of the biomarkers relatively youthful. So what experiments did I do for this test? So the primary one was reducing fructose intake. And for this test, I reduced it from 57 grams per day, which was for the last test, to an average of 48 grams per day for this test. And that may seem like a lot, but as we'll see later on, that's my lowest fructose intake at any point corresponding to any blood test over 50 blood tests since 2015. So why did I do that? Well, I look at correlations for not just macros and micros and foods. I look at correlations for all of that with biomarkers. And in the case of fructose, with a core of 25 biomarkers that represent major organ systems, kidney, liver, metabolic health, inflammation, etc., a relatively higher fructose intake, in my case, is significantly correlated with a net of 6 biomarkers going in the wrong direction relative to the right in terms of how those biomarkers associate with aging and all-cause mortality risk. So to test that correlation, if I reduce fructose intake, I should see at least 6 biomarkers improving. So that was the major experiment for this test. And when considering that my phenoage was 13 years younger, and that's not my best data, that's actually my worst data of the year, one could argue that cutting the fructose may not be good for my biomarkers, or at least being a part of the story for it not being good, and pushing me towards the best data for my biomarkers. Nonetheless, what did I cut? So for those who have been asking for many videos, why so many strawberries? Well, we'll see, because I actually cut strawberry intake from about 500 grams per day to 320 grams per day for this test. And one way I include the strawberries in the daily diet is with a smoothie that includes beets. Beets also contain a lot of fructose as sucrose. So half of sucrose is fructose. And when considering I was eating about 300 grams per day of beets prior to this test, for test number 5, I cut that to 127 grams per day, which saved a little bit of fructose. And then also in that smoothie is fresh parsley, so curly parsley. So because I cut the smoothie, I cut the strawberries, I cut the beets, I also cut the parsley, from an average of 62 grams per day to an average of about 24 grams per day. And note that the parsley is in there for the apigenin with the goal of inhibiting CD38, trying to keep NAD relatively high and avoiding any age-related decrease. I also cut watermelon intake. Watermelon also contains fructose. And then I increased tomatoes, which I didn't go through. I didn't highlight it with arrows on the list, but I increased tomatoes to try to keep my lycopene levels constant, test over test. Nonetheless, I cut watermelon from about 210 grams to about 170 grams per day. All right, so that's it for the major cuts. But just as a note, I also kept mushrooms relatively low, or in the same ballpark as where they were for the last test, because I had a hypothesis that too much nicotinamide from mushrooms may be increasing my homocysteine. And I covered that in an earlier video, and if you missed it, that will be in the right corner. So to test that hypothesis, I repeated the experiment. If I keep mushrooms low, will I see homocysteine at my lowest level over the past 3 years or so once again? And unfortunately, that wasn't the case. Homocysteine did indeed go up by a little bit, which suggests that it wasn't necessarily nicotinamide, too much nicotinamide from the mushrooms. It may be that a higher protein intake, as I documented in that earlier video, may be related to lowering homocysteine, at least in my case. And I plan on covering that in a future video, so stay tuned for that. All right, I also increased oats. So this is steel cut oats, not the steamed. I didn't use the steamed rolled oats. I used steel cut oats, which I cook. And I increased that from an average of about 1 gram per day to 53 grams per day for this test. So why oats? Well, in my data, relatively higher fat and protein intakes are significantly correlated with more biomarkers going in the wrong direction than right. And when considering that I was doing the fructose experiment, I couldn't increase fruit intake. So that only leaves whole grains. So I didn't go with barley. Barley also is a rich source of nicotinamide. And I love barley, whole grain, the whole grain barley. But I didn't want to push nicotinamide higher and potentially affect the homocysteine experiment with mushrooms. So I kept barley relatively low and then included oats. And even though I like oats a lot, as we can see, it was a part of a 13-year younger biological age, but that's, again, not my best data. So whether that was oats, whether that was the fructose or parsley, I don't know. But this overall recipe wasn't great for my biomarkers. So I've since shifted it back to where it was for prior tests, a little bit higher fat, less whole grains, more nuts and seeds, with the goal of trying to get closer to the average 15 to 16 year younger biological age relative to the chronological, or even better if I can. All right, so cheat meals. We already saw that pizza, and that's one slice of pizza. I wasn't eating 16.9 calories of pizza every day. That's insane. That's one slice of Costco pizza over this 42-day period. On 2 of the other days, I also had close to the standard. The standard, for whatever reason, I like homemade Reese's peanut butter cups, so chocolate mixed with peanut butter. I did that on one of the days, but I also mixed some mixed berry jelly for an additional sweet. And then on the second day, I had just the peanut butter mixed with jelly. Now, we can quantify junk calories to see how clean the diet is. So the pizza, the Costco slice, 710, the chocolate, 550, mixed berry jelly, about 320, and that total is about 1,600 calories from quote-unquote junk. And when divided by the total amount of calories consumed for this 42-day period, that's 1.8% of total calories. In other words, the diet was 98% clean. Now, do I have to go even cleaner to get closer to the 15 to 16-year average biological age reduction relative to chronological age? That'll be part of the story for the next few tests to test that hypothesis. All right, so this list is ranked in grams. And as I show for each of these videos, what if we rank the list in terms of top contributors from calories? And that's what we'll see here. So this is the top 10 foods for the average daily calorie intake over that 42-day period that corresponds to blood test number 6. And note that this list is generated by Chronometer. If you want to track your own diet with Chronometer, discount link in the video's description. So atop the list, as it has been for many tests and will continue to be because sardines have a net positive score with those 25 biomarkers, so I have no plans to take them out or reduce their intake. Actually, I've gone higher for the next test to test its correlation with, or to test the protein correlation with homocysteine. So sardines atop the list. What about the remainder of that list? So without going through all of the foods, 8 of the foods on this list are the same as they were for test number 5. And again, not trying to blow up the system, trying to keep the core while making small tweaks to try to improve weak spots. So what entered the top 10 were oats and almonds, and what left were beets and Brazil nuts. So I reduced Brazil nut intake because I was testing the hypothesis that higher selenium may impact the free T3 to free T4 thyroid hormone ratio, and it didn't. So I cut it basically back in half because it didn't make a dent on that or other biomarkers. All right, what about macronutrients? How does that break down for test number 6? In terms of average daily calorie intake, 2145. This is close to my lowest intake since 2021, which was 2076. I may push it lower over the next few tests, but for test number 7, the goal is to be pretty close to 2150, not go lower or higher, just to stay at that level before deciding to go lower to see what is the lowest, the bottom of the U shape in terms of optimizing biomarkers. Average protein intake for the 42-day period was 100 grams per day. For those who want to calculate grams per kilogram body weight, my current body weight is about 141 pounds. And note that I weigh myself every day. That's not an estimate. That's pretty close to accurate, 140 and a half to be exact. So in terms of kilograms, it's about 64 kilograms. So this is about 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram body weight, which has been shown to maximize muscle mass and strength as a result of regular exercise. So I'm right there in terms of the protein intake. It'll be higher for test number 7, though, by about 10 to 15 grams per day. In terms of percentage of calories from protein in the diet, about 19%. All right, next up, fat intake. That's what we can see here. Average daily fat intake was about 82 grams per day, which is 34% of total calories. So total fat was 34% of total calories for this test. And then just for comparison, let's take a look at test number 5. We can see that average daily fat intake was intentionally in the same ballpark. 82 grams per day for this test, 83 grams per day for the last test. And I did another experiment here, though, even though total fat was basically about the same, and that was saturated fat. So as you may have seen in recent videos, for Horvath epigenetic age and the DNA methylation-based estimation of telomere length, for whatever reason, coconut butter and its saturated fatty acids are significantly correlated with an older Horvath epigenetic age and a shorter telomere length. So to test that hypothesis, I cut saturated fat intake from coconut butter in following the correlation for 2 tests. Now, you can see for this test that they're about the same. So I did that experiment now for 2 tests. I don't yet have that data to see if the result was repeatable. So keep sat fat low. Do I get good Horvath and telomere length results? But nonetheless, for test number 7, I've increased the sat fat in coconut butter to do other experiments. But again, note that this small tweaks without blowing up the system, and omega-3 and omega-6 essentially the same, test number 6 versus test number 5. And although monounsaturated fat was higher for test number 6 by 2 grams, this is a pretty close to insignificant increase. All right, next up, carb intake. So that's what we can see here. Total carbs, 291 grams per day. which seems like a lot, but total carbs equals, net carbs, equals total carbs minus fiber. Average daily fiber intake was 84 grams per day, and when subtracting that from total carbs, we get a net carbs of 207 grams per day. We can then multiply that by 4 calories per gram to get a 39% net carb percentage of total calories. Now, also note that fiber contributes calories to the diet, and that's because soluble fiber, which is about 20% of the total fiber intake, is fermented by gut bacteria into short-chain fatty acids. So a fraction of total fiber is converted into fat. And that amount is about 180 calories or 8%. So now we can calculate the net macros that correspond to this test. So 43% fat, so the 34% without the amount coming from fiber fermentation by gut bacteria, 34% plus that 8%, around 8%, we get 43 or close to 43%, 39% net carbs, and about 19% from protein. Now, also note that I don't track correlations with total sugars, but just showing the fructose data. So fructose equals, or total fructose, equals fructose plus sucrose divided by 2. And when adding that together, you can see, as I mentioned earlier, 48 grams per day, which is now my new record for lowest fructose intake over the 50 plus tests since 2015. But again, doing that may not have been great for the biomarkers. And whether that was because I cut fructose or I cut other stuff, whether it's cutting the beets or the parsley or increasing oats, I don't know. But we'll test that hypothesis as I increase fructose back to the 57 or a little bit higher for the next few tests. All right, what about micronutrients? So I'll just pull up the full list of vitamins and minerals. And for anyone that's starting on this journey, what I always recommend is always to try to make sure you can get at least the RDA for all vitamins and minerals. How high above the RDA for some of the vitamins and minerals is debatable and very individual. And I use the correlations, which are on Patreon. All biomarker correlations with diet, foods, macros, and micros are on Patreon. So if you're interested in that, check it out. But I follow those correlations to intentionally go higher than the RDA for many micronutrients. So without highlighting too many, for example, vitamin K, that's about 20x higher than the RDA or adequate intake, which is about 100 micrograms per day. Niacin is about 5x higher. And then you can see all of the carotenoids, alpha and beta carotene, beta cryptozanthin. These are way higher than what's considered an adequate intake or what's recommended, based on what we should be eating. All right, that's all for now. If you're interested in more about my attempts to biohack aging, check us out on Patreon, where you can see daily diet data, not just 42-day averages. I post daily diet data every day on Patreon. I also post biomarker correlations on the correlations tier and a whole bunch of other stuff on Patreon. So if you're interested in more data and more info from my attempts to slow aging and biohack the heck out of it, check us out on Patreon. We've also got discount and affiliate links. So if you're interested in testing yourself while also helping to support the channel, you can do that with Ulta Labs, which is where I get the majority of my blood tests, epigenetic testing, NAD quantification, oral microbiome composition, at-home metabolomics, at-home blood testing with SciFox Health, which includes ApoB, but also GrimAge, the epigenetic test, green tea, diet tracking with Chronometer, or if you'd like to support the channel, you can do that with the website, Buy Me a Coffee. We've also got merch, so if you're interested in wearing the ConquerAging or Diet Trying brand, as I've got on here, that link and all of the other links will be in the video's description. Thanks for watching. I hope that you enjoyed the video. Have a great day.